This evening, GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening, it's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. His Majesty's government is reportedly on course for a change of plan regarding the scrapping of 4,000 redundant EU laws that the United Kingdom inherited from the withdrawal agreement. Could the government scupper one of the greatest of all Brexit opportunities because of idle civil servants? Is the roast beef of Brexit being turned into thin gruel? I'll be joined by a barrister who said he could get the job done on his own within 1 year. The net zero agenda, is it caught in a catch-22 or indeed a catch-2050? The National Infrastructure Commission has warned the government that pursuing net zero has actually made Britain's energy infrastructure more vulnerable to climate change, especially as we become more dependent on wind power. And the government-commissioned review of faith in Britain has been published amidst a number of controversies, including prison radicalisation and religious schooling. The report's author, Colin Bloomer, joins me in the studio. State of the Nation starts now. Joined by our particularly perspicacious panel, the video comment editor at Britain's soundest newspaper, The Telegraph, Mr. Stephen Edgington, and contributing editor at The Socialist, Novara Media, Michael Walker. But as ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.uk. Now it's time for your aperitif with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you and good evening to you. Well, our top story tonight on GB News. Sudan's army has agreed to extend its ceasefire for a further 72 hours. It's unclear, though, whether the rival paramilitary group has agreed. British forces, meanwhile, have evacuated almost 900 people out of the country so far, and those rescue efforts are continuing. The Foreign Secretary said it would be potentially impossible to continue with the operation if the truce had ended. The government's urging those with British passports and visas to make their way to the airfield as soon as possible. We'll keep you up to date on that progress throughout the rest of the evening. Now, here at home, the Royal College of Nursing has been forced to cut short strike action planned for this weekend after the government today won a legal challenge. The High Court ruled part of the 48-hour walkout on Tuesday would be unlawful, as the RCN's 6-month mandate for strike action would have run out the day before. The RCN's General Secretary, Pat Cullen, said the government had lost the trust of nurses and the public. But Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Health, Maria Caulfield, said she was hopeful negotiations would be able to continue.
We recognise that every day of strike has an impact on patients. It's outpatient appointments cancelled, tests cancelled, operations cancelled, and absolutely, we don't want to stop the right to strike, but it has to be done in a legal way, and that's why the Secretary of State took the action he did. Hopefully, we can then get people back around the table, particularly the RCN, to try and come to a resolution overall.
Meanwhile, the RMT union has announced workers across 14 train operators will walk out on the 13th of May after rejecting the latest pay offer. General Secretary Mick Lynch claims the rail delivery group has now reneged on their original proposal. And earlier, ASLEF said its train drivers are planning 3 new strikes across May and June after turning down a 4% pay rise. The action by both unions will impact both the Eurovision Song Contest and the FA Cup final. Detectives searching for the partner of a pregnant teacher who was killed in Glasgow have found a body. Police launched a murder investigation after Morel Sturrock was found dead on Tuesday morning. She was 29 weeks pregnant. Her baby didn't survive. Police Scotland say the body is yet to be formally identified, but it is believed to be that of her fiancé, David Yates, who is wanted in connection with her murder. The DUP's leader says the government's latest budget for Northern Ireland is playing politics and punishing people. The funding allocation is likely to result in significant real-term cuts to public services. Devolution is currently suspended because the DUP is boycotting power sharing over post-Brexit trade. But Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris says he'll continue to hold talks with leaders in Stormont.
The purpose was not to punish anybody with this budget. The purpose of this budget is to make sure public services can continue in the absence of an executive. Now, I do want to see an executive up and running, and that's why I continue to have talks with DUP representatives, and let's see where they lead to.
That's your news. That's all from me. I'm back in an hour now. Back to Jacob.
The retained EU law bill, a rule, has been something that has been wandering through Parliament since the end of October, and it's fundamental to the completion of Brexit. What it's about is restoring our freedoms so that the law of the United Kingdom is our own law, rather than a law imposed upon us by the EU since 1973. And the question is, are we now getting, instead of the roast beef of the full Brexit that we were hoping for with roast potatoes and Yorkshire pudding and lashings of gravy, merely thin gruel, as rumours come out, reported in the Daily Telegraph, that instead of 4,000 rules going to be got rid of, only 800 will be removed. Because actually, if you think of the complaints people had about the EU over the decades, it was often about the detailed pettifogging rules interfering in every aspect of our lives. Things like how strong a hoover could be when it was doing its dutiful hoovering business. It's that type of rule that makes us less economically adaptable, but also has just been annoying to people. Why do we have to have rules that interfere in the minutiae of our lives? And these 4,000, and they include all sorts of things. They include the energy trading scheme, which is making our heavy industry fundamentally inefficient. They include all the product standards. They include a whole range of DEFRA-related rules that have blighted people's lives and been such a nuisance for farmers. And what we need to do is grasp our freedoms with both hands, not just take the easy route of sticking closely to the EU, following it as a regulatory base, but grasping the opportunity to be genuinely free, competitive, to have the famous supply-side reforms that may lead to economic growth. And not doing that shows a lack of ambition from the civil service. And the problem here, as I understand it, is the civil service doesn't want to deliver. Because the minister in charge, Kemi Badenoch, is one of the most dynamic ministers in the government. In many ways, if she can't do it, it must be that there is a real detailed obstacle there of delivery by those who are paid to deliver. Because a lot of the work has already been prepared. There's a dashboard that actually was done when I was Minister for Brexit Opportunities that sets out thousands of these rules. So you can see what they are. You can see how much better off we'd be without them. every rule when it was introduced would have had the details set out in an explanatory memorandum. All of these are stored away. And instead we're getting inertia from the civil service, and we're getting scare stories with people saying we won't have employment rights and we won't have other protections. But bear in mind, Holidays with Pay Act was 1938. The Sale of Goods Act was even earlier in 1893. Our rights have always predated and go above the European Union. 14 weeks maternity leave required by the EU, 39 weeks in the UK. So what we need to do is grasp the opportunities, direct the civil service, and not allow the blob to stop us achieving the prosperity that we can get by using our sovereignty to break free of the EU. As always, I want to know what you think. Email me at mailmog@gbnews.uk. But with me now is a barrister who said he could get the entire job done on his own within 1 year, Mr. Stephen Barrett. Let's put civil service ambition into a cocked hat. Stephen, do you want to run through how you think this could be done so quickly and so efficaciously by one man against the hundreds of thousands of civil servants who can't do it?
Well, I wouldn't say that that is particularly speedy. And when I said that I could do it on my own in a year, and I meant it, I planned to have holidays. And I also said that a competent law firm could do this within a month. And I still stand by that. This is 4,000 pieces of secondary legislation. Very little of it had any scrutiny when it was made. Very little of it does anything relevant. There have been an awful lot of myths about it. It's absolutely right that you highlight that maternity and paternity leave is going nowhere, because that's enshrined in an Act of Parliament. And Acts of Parliament aren't going anywhere. It's only this secondary type of legislation, this much lower level stuff that's going. Now, it's true that the technical length of maternity leave is in one of these, but if it died tomorrow, the relevant minister could create it again the next day. So, and what's actually been going on whilst the retained EU law bill is delayed, and it might interest you to know this, it is the process that is going on. So the reason for that is the EU would make laws and they'd become Acts of Parliament, and the power to make these secondary laws would be in those Acts of Parliament. That's why maternity and paternity leave would never go permanently, because a minister would always have that power enshrined in the Act of Parliament. It's quite clear that some ministers are using the powers that they have from these EU originating Acts of Parliament already, even without the retained EU law bill going through. But what they are doing is they are flagging up things which are obviously silly, like the legal framework to meet the Kyoto 2020 agreement. Now, it's obviously 2023, so we don't need that anymore. So unsurprisingly, that has been repealed. A whole bunch of carbon dioxide stuff is gone, but that's because the EU is implementing a brand new carbon scheme, which, by the way, I think we will adhere to. And so you can get rid of these easy ones because they're obviously wrong. Anything that's being amended, like I was looking at one just before coming on, the EU had a regulatory system for aerosols. That's just being copied into our law. So it's no longer an EU law, that's gone. But everything that was the law of that, the whole regime, has just been copy and pasted into UK law. So anybody who wanted divergence, on the track record of what we're seeing, there will be no divergence. We will
and this is where we need
law.
Political drive to get divergence. But the thing that worries me is that the civil service looks at the opinion polls, thinks there may be a different government in the not-too-distant future, and that it'll be much easier to track and follow the EU if we haven't done the divergence thoroughly by then. And therefore there's a sort of blob incentive to go slow.
Well, I mean, if that's true, then I think the civil service has to face the embarrassment of that. Because I'm not sitting here saying I could do it in a year in some sort of dramatic or even interesting fashion. You know, this is not a particularly challenging task. These are not exciting or interesting laws. I mean, there are interesting policy options. So the EU took control of the UK mortgage market. And if anybody thinks, I have no view on policy, but if anybody thought that the UK mortgage market wasn't working well, so there's a piece today on a young gentleman who can't get a mortgage and he's trapped in bad rental conditions and he wants to get a mortgage. If anybody wanted to tweak the rules in order to get him a mortgage, then you'd need to change all of this retained EU law. That would need policy direction from the government, and it would need an appetite for divergence. But at the moment, all that's happening is the scribes are very painstakingly slowly going through and just crossing out the word EU law and putting UK law on top of the same thing.
Well, we need to do better than that, I think. But thank you very much, Stephen. It's now over to my sagacious panel, video comment editor at The Telegraph, Stephen Edgington, and contributing editor at Novara Media, Michael Walker. Is it fair to say that there is a go slow on this, or do you think that it's simply too difficult to change 4,000 laws?
Well, I think, to me, it seems like it might not be worth it. So if there are laws that we want to diverge on, I don't see why we can't just do that law by law. If there's a problem with our mortgage market and the way it's regulated and we want to diverge from the EU, why not do that? Just do that. It seems to me that, you know, there are a lot of crises that our country is facing. It takes a very long time for an ambulance to come if you want to see the NHS. We have to deal with the climate crisis. There is a war in Ukraine. If we've got all of these civil servants who, what you want them to be doing is putting all their effort into going through every single piece of regulation that we have from the EU and saying, oh, we're going to arbitrarily choose a slightly different form of regulation.
But
it seems like a waste of time.
It doesn't seem like that much effort. If one man could do it in 1 year...
Well, that's what this gentleman says.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
We don't have proof of that. But also, what do you achieve by doing that, right? So a lot of these red tape... What you like to call red tape is essentially health and safety regulations, stuff such as that. Now, you use the example of how much a Hoover should be able to suck. Now, I'm not a Hoover expert, but I assume we do need some form of regulation as to Hoover's safety, and they can't be bothered to rewrite them all.
Actually, I went to see Sir James Dyson about this, and he pointed out to me that other countries don't have these product-specific regulations. It's very much an EU thing, and there are dozens of those that if we had the drive to do it, we could just get rid of.
I think that's right. I think there are certain EU laws which definitely hold back British businesses. I mean, one of the stories that I've worked on recently is about cultivated meat. And cultivated meat companies in the UK are finding it very difficult to get approval from the regulator because we have basically taken EU regulations on that, sort of completely transferred that into British law. Whereas in America and Singapore, they have far more sort of easier regulators to sort of approve this stuff. It's a lot easier and a lot quicker to do that. But I think there's also another point is, you know, you guys can blame the civil service all you like, and I think, you know, fair enough, blame the civil servants. But it's the Conservative Party that have been in power with an 80-seat majority since 2019. You know, this is about delivering Brexit, you know, and I think you guys should take some responsibility for that as well.
So political drive is needed in addition to the civil service getting on with things.
Absolutely. And as you say, if we don't scrap these laws and Labour come into power in 18 months' time, then that's the path to rejoining the European Union is far easier.
And you probably won't admit it even if you know, but do you think an incoming Labour government would actually quite like quietly to shadow the EU to try and ease some of the issues in the relationship between GB or the UK and the European Union?
Potentially. I mean, I think what's clear from the Labour Party is they don't want to relight the Brexit culture war, right? So I think they're very attuned to the idea that there are certain things that the public really care about when it came to divergence, I suppose, on things such as migration. I doubt they'll make many changes there. And there are lots of things that the general public don't really care about, which is how much a Hoover sucks or various other rules and regulations which pertain to products,
but
right?
Do you think...
So to me, I think Labour are going to prioritise having as friction-free trade as possible with Europe, whilst not crossing those red lines that some people in the public really care about, which to me seems like a pretty sensible position, rather than saying, oh, we have to arbitrarily get rid of 4,000 laws and rewrite them again.
Okay, but the issue is how much do people care? Because I think one of the constant irritants with the EU was this detailed law coming in. It was the newspapers were writing about it week in, week out. I mean, the Telegraph had regular stories, and Boris Johnson wrote frequently about another nutty EU regulation. And so I just wonder whether that's right, or Michael's right, or whether people, in fact, do dislike the detailed regulation that sits there.
Well, there are some laws that really do impact people's lives. I mean, I'll give you a good example. This is a relatively new law from the European Union since Brexit. But they're trying to pass a Digital Services Act. So basically, this would regulate social media companies to try and tackle what they call hate speech and disinformation. Now, I think hate speech and disinformation are really difficult to define. I think that they use this to try and censor people with dissident views, particularly Conservatives. And imagine if the UK decided, well, let's just take up this law. It's far easier to stick with the European Union regulations because it will be easier to trade with the European Union and we won't have to diverge, and it will just be far simpler for our companies. You know, that's a big legislation, big piece of law that could impact people's lives.
And that then denies you the opportunity of the freer market. And the EU, of course, wants us to remain aligned because it doesn't want to have a hyper-competitive economy on its borders.
Well, I suppose I would just point out you made a sort of allusion beforehand. People really care about it, and they wrote about this a lot in the Telegraph. Now, those two things aren't the same. So yes, there were many. You might think they're the same. There were many. A Europe correspondent, Boris Johnson was one of them, who liked to write endlessly about the shapes of bananas and such like. Now, bananas for me have been fairly satisfactory for quite a while in Britain, inside or outside the EU.
I absolutely hate
the curvature of them wasn't a problem. So I think this is a bit of a sort of petty obsession of people such as you in the political class, which I don't think ordinary people really care about when it comes to these regulations.
I think that got a lot of traction, and that it was part of the reason behind Brexit, that people just thought there was this unaccountable body that constantly spewed out laws. And you don't think that mattered?
Well, to me, it just seems like a very minor issue. And I think also what you'll get here, I mean, you're talking about hate speech and stuff. You saw a similar thing with Elon Musk when he bought Twitter. So when he was outside of Twitter, he's looking at you saying, oh, they're constantly censoring people. We need to get rid of all of this regulation, all of this moderation. He buys the company, realises, oh, actually, you do have to do some of this. But so you end up just reinventing the wheel. So what we're going to end up asking our civil servants to do is just reinvent the wheel.
But didn't he prove this, the BBC? He's got rid of all the moderators, and there isn't a great surge in hate speech.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's a completely separate issue. But, yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to over-regulate these big tech companies. That the Democrats and others, and the European Union, I think, are trying to use this legislation to try and shut down dissident voices, as I said earlier, conservative voices, conservative opinions on various things. So, yeah, I mean, look, companies can... There's definitely a line, and there definitely has to be some regulation, but I think companies are pretty good at self-regulating themselves on these things.
Well, it's good to end on a free market note. Thank you to my brilliant panel. Don't forget to let me know what you think. Mailbag at gbnews.uk. Coming up, the publication of the Independent Review of Faith in Britain has coincided with a number of religious controversies cropping up in the news. The author of the report will be here with me live in the studio.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political budgets.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News. The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Radio.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. And you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Thank you. Alan says, I'm disgusted that the current administration has not taken action to scrap the unnecessary and outdated basket of EU laws. The only conclusion is to draw is yet another Ramona gambit to drag us back in. Disgraceful. John, it's pretty obvious that this government doesn't want to capitalise on Brexit. I have to vote elsewhere in 2024, no names mentioned. I have no choice if I don't. I would be accepting a government that has reneged on the Brexit opportunities and currently extorting an entire population with fatuous energy taxes. Well, we must have a discussion on energy taxes in the not-too-distant future. Bruce says this government has no intention of bringing about a full Brexit, and in fact, Jeremy Hunt is deliberately sabotaging the economy with high corporation tax to depress growth and make the argument for rejoining the EU stronger. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but thank you for your mailmogs. Keep them flowing in. The independent faith review, commissioned by the Levelling Up Secretary, was published yesterday. The review covered a broad range of subjects, including religious schooling, radicalisation and forced marriages. Its author, Colin Bloom, published 22 recommendations, some of which could be seen as controversial, including a call for registration and inspection of religious educational institutions. But perhaps above all, the review fundamentally recognises the importance of faith in society and the contribution that it makes to the state. Colin, thanks so much for coming in and for your very important report, because you do start by setting out that without the contribution of religious groups, our society would be much poorer.
Yes, and we did more than 21,000 responses to our call for evidence, one of the largest calls for evidence that the government, I think, has ever had. And it just demonstrates how important faith is to so many people. It's still worth, I think, remembering that more than the vast majority, more people have a faith in the UK than don't have a faith. And it's just very different today. So perhaps 50 years ago, the faith landscape would have looked very different to the way it does today. But overwhelmingly, faith, people of faith and places of worship make a tremendous contribution to British society. And as the report says, it's very well evidenced. And I think that, if that is true, which it is, government should embrace faith communities to get the best out of them and work together so that they can deliver public services more effectively and more efficiently.
But part of your argument seemed to me to be that the state doesn't actually understand this, and that the organs of the state, whether it's the NHS or the prison service or even schools, don't appreciate what is done for them by religious activity.
So the title of the report is "Does Government Do God?" and a
quotation from Alistair Campbell.
Yes. From when he was Tony Blair's communications guru. But the answer to that is it's a mixed bag, but probably not, and they need to do a lot more to so that they can understand how important faith is to so many people in the UK. And so one of the recommendations is that we have an independent faith champion in government who has the relational capital to work across all of the different faith communities and to lead, I suppose, the communications and the engagement with between government, be the interlocutor between government and faith communities, but also to increase faith literacy amongst public servants. It is not good enough that a public servant doesn't know the difference between a Sikh and a Hindu. If they are there to draft and implement the legislation that members of Parliament put down, they have to know the people.
And you mentioned Sikh ceremonial knives not being included in a knives bill because it simply hadn't been thought about.
Yeah, or Hindus being given halal food, or Jews being given non-kosher meals. Those are the basics, but government needs to do so much more than that.
And one of the things you pointed out was that during the pandemic there was a lot of conversations between government and various faith groups, but that seems to have run into the sand subsequently.
So, you know, I was appointed by Boris Johnson in 2019. Then the pandemic happened, and then, you know, my role pivoted slightly. So I set up the round tables between government and places of worship. There was a lot of interaction between them. We had a Sikh round table, a Hindu round table, a Christian round table, and a Jewish round table, a Muslim round table. And what was important there is that we had the plurality of different voices, including women and young people, but we were able to communicate and dialogue with, you know, not necessarily all the usual suspects, but it was very, very effective. Since the pandemic we've moved on from there, that's fizzled out. And I think we've lost some of that dynamic where government can communicate more effectively with different faith communities.
But in spite of recognising the good that religion does, you also have some concerns. One of the bits I read with particular care was on religious education, because it seems to me that the state wants to have it both ways, that state schools, and indeed private schools, now have to follow quite a government-set agenda on what they're allowed to say and what they're allowed to teach, that sometimes conflicts, from my point of view, with the teaching of the Catholic Church. And if you want your child to have a Catholic education, you actually have to move outside the state system.
I mean, that's a very good point. The focus of my report is much more on safeguarding. So it's about the safeguarding of children who are in out-of-school settings. These are schools, they're not technically schools, but they look like a school, they talk like a school, they quack like a school. Yeah,
yes,
they quack like a duck. Yeah, there are schools. And the main worry is particularly with yeshivas, they are the Jewish schools, and madrasas, which are the Islamic schools, where the focus, I don't think, should be on some of the perhaps some of the ideological or doctrinal issues that you're talking about, but much more the focus, I think, should be on the welfare of the children. Are the buildings safe? Do we have do we have the appropriate background checks done on the adults that are in there? You know, the tragedy of there was a recent ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, did demonstrate that some of these out-of-school settings, there are horrendous crimes done against children, which is why we need to make sure...
But this is purely about safeguarding. It's not about saying you mustn't teach the Ten Commandments, you mustn't teach the Catholic Catechism, or any of these things, which are quite hard to do in a secular school setting.
I don't go into any of that in the report. The focus is entirely on the well-being and safeguarding of children.
And just a brief word on marriage, that this is unregulated marriages. You think that people carrying them out should be regulated, but people should still be free. There's a great line, which I think I've just got time to quote, because some couples may also genuinely regard religious law as more valuable than civil law. As it happens, exactly my position. When I got married, I wanted to be married in the eyes of the Catholic Church. What His Majesty's government thought, I didn't really care about. So you wouldn't stop people having purely religious marriages, but you'd make sure they agreed to them freely, which has been at the heart of marriage law for the last 250 years.
The whole point is about coercion and about people being able to make their own decisions without being misled or lied to. The big thrust around marriage, though, is it's not that, and I'm glad you read that out. That's an important distinction. The big push has to be on forced and coercive marriages. In this country, we have thousands every year, thousands of mainly young girls and women who are coerced and forced into marriages, and government have to get this right. They've ducked it for too long.
Well, before we started, Colin and I were talking about the 1753 Hardwicke's Marriage Act, which was dealing with exactly the same problem. So history repeats, and it's why we should always know our history. But thank you, Colin. Coming up, it's the Catch 2050, the very infrastructure that is supposed to hurtle us towards our net zero goal is itself vulnerable to climate change, without apparently more of your money, £10 billion of taxpayers' money, being spent. Find out my panel's view on this after a few words from our sponsors.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know, Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Pam says, sadly, it's not surprising that Christianity is on the wane, as schools no longer have daily assemblies and weekly church services, not to mention the lack of religious knowledge, as now all religions are on the curriculum. I must confess one of the joys of my education was all the Anglican hymns, which are one of the great beauties of British music and language. Richard says, if civil servants obstruct or refuse to implement the instructions of the government, sack them, as would happen in the private sector. Yes, well, sacking civil servants is not an easy business, as we know. In the drive to protect ourselves from climate change, we are making ourselves more susceptible to climate change. The catch 2050, if you will. The National Infrastructure Commission has warned that dependence on decarbonised electricity systems increases risks like storm damage to overhead wires, which could become more disruptive. The energy derived from wind is supplied to homes and businesses through overhead cables, while traditional fuels like gas are connected through pipelines underground. They caution that a failure to adapt infrastructure could leave the UK vulnerable to power outages. Wind currently accounts for around a quarter of the UK's electricity supply. The expectation is that this will almost double by 2050. Continuing on to state the obvious, the NIC said low wind could disrupt power supplies as the UK's reliance on wind turbines increased. If being left cold in your home, perhaps unable to cook or even charge your car for periods doesn't appeal, then why are we persisting down this path? Stephen, this is a story that came from The Telegraph, your paper. Are we taking a risk without realising what we're doing? Are we willing the end without working out the means to get there?
I think the problem with net zero is that it's just not well thought out. So, for example, if we do have power outages because of storms and things, and suddenly everyone's got an electric car, how are you going to charge your car? How are you going to get to work? How are you going to go out about your business? If you have an electric heat pump, for example, instead of a gas boiler, this could cause problems again. If there's power outage, you can't use, your shower or whatever. So as we make this transition to net zero, there's all these unintended consequences that could happen. And I think we're going far too quickly, and we're not considering all of these other problems that could come up.
And Michael, do you think it will maintain public support if we have power outages, if people are cold, and that therefore trying to go too fast ends up being counterproductive?
Yeah, I suppose I just want to point out, because we're getting this story from a Telegraph article, right? That's what the producer sent me.
But it's from the National Infrastructure
But this is what's
Commission.
interesting. So I saw the headline in the Telegraph. So it was, net zero will leave UK more vulnerable to power cuts caused by storms. People could be left sitting in cold homes or unable to charge cars. National Infrastructure Commission warns. Then I went to their website, so the National Infrastructure Commission website, and this is how they summarised the letter. National Infrastructure Commission call for urgent action to protect infrastructure from climate risks. So the letter to the government was to say, look, climate change is going to bring with it lots of risks, such as more severe storms and more severe heat, and therefore we need to adapt to that. And now this has been twisted by the Telegraph to say trying to mitigate against climate change is what's going to cause us problems.
But it's another cost for the taxpayers, another £10 billion a year on top of the climate change charges, which already make our electricity 25% more expensive than...
But we will need to do this either way. So basically what they're saying, right, they are saying that climate change itself is going to cause us to have a more insecure energy system.
But not if we carried on using gas, because that goes in pipelines.
Well, we can't use gas for everything, right? So the situation... So their argument...
We use gas for a lot of
So what they're
things.
saying is, look, increased storms, increased severe weather, which we are more likely to see because of climate change, risks more power outages when it comes to electricity. Now, whether or not we move to electric cars, whether or not we move to heat pumps, that's going to be a problem. No one wants power outages. So what they're saying is, what we should do is invest in putting some of these cables underground or cut some trees from nearby pylons, so when there's extreme storms,
they do that anyway.
Knock that down. Well, they're saying let's do more of it, essentially. Right. What they're saying is, look, climate change is real. It's a huge challenge. It's making us all more vulnerable, and so we need to deal with it. They've also said that, yes, if we use more electricity for things such as cars and heat pumps, then it makes protecting our energy grid even more important than it was before. But protecting the energy grid is always important, and the fact is, what they're saying is that climate change is the threat, not action to mitigate against climate change. I just think it's very bizarre, this framing that
Except they're going much further than the IPCC, which pointed out in its recent report that the number of hurricanes and so on in the US hasn't changed over 100 years, and that actually the ability to link all these events to climate change is not invariably proved. So there's a lot of propaganda that we're getting.
I think the point that Michael was making is partly true, in the sense that these organisations don't disagree with net zero as a policy. They do agree with net zero. They're making points about, as you say, climate change causing more severe weather, but also the fact that we're not adapting quickly enough to these net zero policies. So, these overhead cables could cause problems if we do have power outages because of the electric cars, because of the electric heat pumps. So yeah, I mean, look,
it's not strictly because of them. So if you have a power outage, that's already a big problem.
Well, you're more vulnerable. You're more vulnerable because now you can fill your car up with petrol.
Exactly.
And so your car still works.
I want to go back to your IPCC claim, to be honest, because one, I mean, none of us here are climate scientists. I think you have a very bad record of trying to summarise IPCC reports. You said in 2014 that the IPCC said action won't have any effect until a century. And I think your sort of comment on that was, so what's the point?
I'm delighted that you remember my comments from 2014.
That's because you're a former energy minister. You're a significant public figure, and I think you have a terrible record when it comes to communicating the dangers of climate change. And I think you're doing the same here. So the IPCC...
I think this was in their report, actually.
What the IPCC say... No, so in the report that you got wrong, they were saying it will if we don't take action now, it's going to we're going to live with that for over 100 years. You said it's not going to have any effect till over 100 years, which is obviously wrong. Now, in terms of
I can't remember. We need to look at the report. I'm not going to accept your interpretation of what I said 10 years ago.
In terms of the extreme weather events, every single scientific body, the Met Office, the IPCC, says we are going to see, and we are already seeing, more extreme weather events.
But they did also say in their last report that there was the same number of hurricanes in the US.
In what period of time?
From now to 100 years ago.
From now to 100 years ago.
That was in their latest report.
In the US, are they stronger now? Because, I mean, if you look at all of them, I mean, again, at the moment we are seeing the highest, this week, the highest temperature they have ever witnessed in Thailand, 45 degrees. And because it's humid, that feels like 54 degrees. So that's probably going to kill people. Last year in this country, we saw temperatures above 40 degrees. Before that, the record was 38.7, and that was just a couple of years before that. So the idea that you're still in 2023 sitting here saying that, oh, does climate change really cause extreme weather? I mean, we've moved on from this.
I'm not saying that climate change isn't a thing. I'm just saying, how do you deal with it in a way that people are going to be willing to pay for in a timescale that is practical? And I think 2050 is too short a timescale and too expensive.
I think that's the problem is this 2050, this net zero policy. It goes too quickly, it goes too far, it's utopian, it's almost Stalinist in having these kind of, you know, these long-term plans. And you don't consider the actual impacts on ordinary people's lives. I mean, these costs could be immense for very, you know, working class, ordinary Brits. For example, installing an electric heat pump. This could cost thousands of pounds for ordinary people. Electric cars, again, the technology isn't there. It's very, very expensive, you know, these cars. Why can't we just stick
They're not in China, actually. They've made a very cheap electric
Thank you
car
to my
in China.
panel. I don't think anybody will vote in the end to be cold and poor. But up next, we'll be hearing a very personal and tragic story from the mother of a young man who lost his life after recreational drug use, and her brave and inspiring campaign to raise awareness and change the law.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing. We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. And thank you, because you've been getting in touch with your mail mogs. Peter says, We need to stop buying our own gas and oil on world markets and start producing more of both. Do we really have to freeze now because the world might increase in temperature in the next 1,000 years? Jerry says, come along now, Jacob. You know as well as I do that the UK energy market is a racket. No engineer in their right mind would advocate running the country on intermittent and unreliable wind and solar generation, which cannot operate without 100% backup from reliable thermal generation, which ensures that we pay twice for our energy, even before the unfair taxes on coal and gas and the exorbitant subsidies for renewables. So thank you for getting in touch. Now, 12 years ago, Emma Kane's 17-year-old son, John, died after he inhaled the substance butane, which is used in cigarette lighters. Emma has been campaigning to ban the abuse of substances like butane and the more commonly used nitrous oxide, often known as laughing gas. Last month, it was announced for the first time that the possession of nitrous oxide would be made a criminal offence under the government's new antisocial behaviour plan. And I'm honoured to welcome John's mother, Emma, to speak to me now. I think she's been so brave to come in because it must be so hard for you, but so important to campaign for this ban after the death of your son, John.
Yes, it's something very, very close to my heart. Absolutely.
And you were saying to me that you now go up to people when you see them inhaling substances to warn them of what can happen.
I do. I've even got some of them to let go of their balloons. I tell them how dangerous it is. I tell them that my son died inhaling gas, and that they're harming themselves, you know, they're doing damage to themselves. And what would their parents do if their parents lost them, you know?
And people don't realise how dangerous it is, do they? They think it's...
They don't, no.
Just a high...
They think it's just laughing gas. It's, you know, they think it's harmless. They don't really don't realise how dangerous it is.
And butane's even more dangerous.
Yes.
And that's obviously what killed your son.
Yeah.
And you're campaigning, and you've been successful in your campaign for laughing gas to be banned, and hopeful that that will have an effect, and also that the message will get out. So how are you running your campaign? Where are you going? You're obviously on here tonight.
I'm just doing what I can. I've started from stopping them on the streets to putting my story in the local paper, and it's gone from there. I've contacted by various companies. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention.
Do mention.
Okay. I put it in the Echo, and then from there I got contacted by ITV, then BBC. I've got my story. Had my story put in the That's Life December issue magazine. I've done a couple of BBC interviews, and Daily Express are supporting me with my campaign as well. And yeah, and I'm here with
And
you.
have you been speaking to young people as well, and not just ones when you've seen them on the street, but do you give talks?
I did stop a couple of teenagers, not that they wasn't doing anything like that, but just to get their point of view across on things, and why they think that kids of their age would be doing that. Because, you know, it's important to get their view and why they're doing it, you know, because only when you know the root cause of why they're doing it and help them with that, you know, you can help them to
And
move
why
forward.
do you think people are doing it? What is the incentive?
I mean, obviously, I don't know the exact reason for why every teenager is doing it, but, you know, there's lots of reasons. It's mental health, you know, you don't know what they've been through in the past. It could just be that they're just having fun, you know, and they don't realise the dangers. And there's a lot of parents out there that actually don't know the dangers, which means that they can't tell their kids of the dangers. And, you know, it's, yeah.
And the ban will at least reinforce the idea of a danger, because obviously people take drugs that are illegal as well as legal highs, but at least it's highlighted that there's a danger and that there's a risk.
Absolutely.
That possibly
yes.
John didn't realise.
No, John was just having fun with his friends. He didn't realise, you know. In regards to the ban, that's more to give the police the powers to be able to deal with the dark side of it all. Because, you know, at the moment, they've hardly got anything, you know. They're clutching onto what powers they can get to deal with it, but now they can. So that was more really that the side of the ban that, you know, that they can deal with. I know it's already gone underground. You know, these experts are saying, you know, well, you know, you're criminalising people and it's going to drive it underground. Of course it's going to drive it underground. You can't cure it. You know, as much as I would love to wave my magic wand and, you know, stop any parent from having to go through something like that, you know, it's going to go underground, but it already has. They're already selling it illegally because they're putting it in bags with a packet of balloons before the people walk out of the shop. So they're already selling it illegally,
But
you
at
know?
least the police now can do something, can stop it,
Yeah.
And can save people in future.
Absolutely.
from
I'm
these risks.
not out to criminalise anybody. I want to save our kids, you know, and it's criminals out there that are using it as well, and that side does need to be dealt with, you know, because it's what it leads to, that you know, crime and antisocial behaviour and stuff like that. That needs to be able to be dealt with.
I think all my viewers will be full of admiration for your courage. I think it's so brave when you've suffered a tragedy like this to come on public television to save other people. I think it's truly noble.
It's what you would want me to be doing.
Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
That's all from me this evening. Up next, it's Dan Wootton. Dan, it's always very difficult to follow a story like Emma's, but I'll hand over to you with something else for later.
Indeed. Thank you, Jacob. Really powerful interview, of course. We've got lots on the way this evening. As I mentioned to you earlier in the week, it was inevitable, wasn't it, after Dominic Raab's sacking that, or forced quitting, you might say, that they're now coming for Steve Barclay. So I'm going to chew that over with my superstar panel, Carol McGiffin, Sean Bailey and Amy Nicol.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm sure everyone will enjoy listening to that. That's coming up after the weather, and let's hope the bank holiday weekend the sun is shining in Somerset. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. This has been State of the Nation, and you, dear viewer, have been, as always, Moggalicious.
Evening, Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update. A bit of a wet one out there at the moment. That'll lead to a fairly dull start tomorrow, but it should cheer up as we go through the day, and for many, it'll start to feel quite a bit warmer. But right now we've got a couple of areas of low pressure, a big one out in the Atlantic driving this smaller one across the country. It's been providing outbreaks of rain for many already today, and that rain becoming more extensive through this evening, spreading into northern England, southern Scotland, turning a little drier perhaps across southernmost counties of England, but for most it's a pretty damp night, a cloudy night, a breezy night in places. But it won't be as cold as recent nights, temperatures mostly holding up at 6 or 7 and double figures across the south. On to Friday, and it does start pretty dull and for many pretty damp, but generally dry conditions across the south, and it should cheer up, should get a bit brighter through the day, certainly for parts of Wales, southwest England by lunchtime, and then western Scotland, southern England, and eventually parts of the Midlands, likely to see some fleeting glimpses of sunshine. Eastern areas always staying fairly glum and quite cold. Northern Ireland brightening up with the potential for some heavy showers. In the south, well, we could see temperatures up to 19, maybe even 20 Celsius, where we get some blue sky. The clouds and the outbreaks of rain will continue to fritter away to the east during Friday evening, so most places start the weekend dry. Going to be a bit of a messy one this weekend. There'll be cloud and rain at times for Northern Ireland, southern Scotland on Saturday, and then some heavy showers breaking out in the afternoon, parts of Wales, the Midlands, Northern Ireland, but mostly dry. Northern Scotland, southern and eastern England, largely dry on Saturday as well. And again, where we see some sunshine, warmer than it has been.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me